Close your eyes for a moment and picture two ordinary things in front of you: a bronze statue bathed in afternoon light and a tiny seed tucked into soil, perhaps beneath a thin veil of moss. The statue seems solid, its features clear, the curves and lines already compelling us to see a story of intention in metal. The seed sits quiet and unassuming, a mere hint of green in a brown capsule, and yet in a certain sense it already contains the entire story of a tree that might become tall and shade-giving, flowering and fruit-bearing. Aristotle invites us to pause with these images, because from such everyday objects we can begin to see the deepest architecture of being. He asks us to shift from what things do to what they are, from mere appearances to the underlying structure that makes their coming to be intelligible. In foundations like these we glimpse what he calls substance, the primary kind of being, the thing that endures as what it is through change and time, despite all the transformation around it. If we had to name the core problem Aristotle takes up, it might be summarized as this: how do we explain that something that comes to be, that grows or changes, remains the same thing in the middle of becoming? And how can we account for why a thing exists at all in a way that makes sense of its purposes, its ends, its directions? He answers with a careful architecture that we can call hylomorphism, the claim that every natural thing is a composite of matter and form. Matter is the substratum, the raw stuff out of which things are made. Form is the arrangement, the idea, the principle that organizes that stuff into something with a recognizable nature. The statue is made of bronze, the bronze is its matter. The statue's form, the specific shape, the pattern of its lines, the plan that makes it legible as an artwork, is the form. But even more, for Aristotle, form is the actuality that gives matter its definite character. It is the organization that makes potential matter into a particular being. The seed, likewise, is not simply a blob of matter, but a seed with a form that, given the right conditions, can become a tree. The seed's matter is its organic tissue, its built-in material possibilities. Its form is its potential to become a plant with leaves, roots, trunk, and height. From this combination of form and matter, Aristotle derives a pair that recurs throughout his philosophy: the potentiality and the actuality. Potentiality is the capacity, the propensity, the latent power something carries within it. Actuality is the realized state, the thing as it now exists, the fulfillment of its capacity. The bronze in the statue is passive potentiality. Given a sculptor's touch, given fire, chisels, time, that matter becomes something with shape and significance. The seed likewise contains the potential to become a tree. What stands between seed and tree is a process of change, a series of transformations tied to the plant's nature and its surroundings. To put it simply, potentiality is not yet what it is, and actuality is what it becomes through the shaping forces at work on it. Aristotle's most powerful and enduring move is to show how form and matter, potentiality and actuality, are bound together in what he calls the four causes. This is not a mere taxonomy but a causal account, a way to explain why a thing is as it is, why it came to be, and why it serves a certain end. The four causes are not isolated. They weave together to explain change, persistence, and purpose in a comprehensive way. Let's begin with the material cause, the matter out of which something is made. In the bronze statue, the material cause is the bronze itself, the copper and tin alloy that gives the statue its body. In the seed, the material cause is the organic matter of the seed cells, the seed's own substance that holds the genetic and biochemical resources necessary for growth. The material cause is not a mere passive ingredient. It is the substrate that sets the constraints and capacities for what can come to be. But matter alone does not explain why a statue is a statue, or why a seed becomes something else. For that we need the formal cause, the form, the pattern, the defining principle that sorts matter into a particular kind of being. The formal cause for the statue is its shape, its design, the idea of bronze statue that the sculptor aims to realize. It is the form that gives the statue its identity, not just any lump of bronze, but something with stance, proportion, and significance, the expression of a statue that communicates to a viewer. For the seed, the formal cause is the plant species and its organization as a life form with roots, shoots, leaves, and the genetic blueprint that dictates how it grows. The formal cause governs the internal arrangement. The arrangement of tissues and organs, the kind of growth, the capacity to respond to light, water, and gravity. The form is the plan, the essence that makes this stone a statue with a narrative of human intention, or this seed a potential tree with a particular lineage. But the four causes do not stop there. Aristotle then introduces the efficient cause, the agent or process that brings the thing into being. For the bronze statue, the efficient cause is the sculptor, with the hammer, the chisel, and the skill that translates a design into material reality. The sculptor's workshop, the tools, his hands, and even the time spent shaping the bronze contribute to the statue's actual emergence. The efficient cause can also be the melting and molding processes that give the material its final form. For the seed growing into a tree, the efficient cause is the plant's biological processes working in concert with environmental factors. The enzymes and cellular machinery driving photosynthesis, the energy captured from sunlight, the water drawn from soil, the minerals absorbed, and even the weather that conditions growth. The seed's growth is also the product of countless efficient causes, germination triggers, the interplay with microorganisms in the soil, the rhythm of day and night, the season's warmth. And then there is the final cause, the end, the purpose, or the reason why a thing exists in the first place. This is perhaps the most controversial and the most lively locus of debate in Aristotle's account. What is the final cause of a bronze statue? Why was it made at all? The straightforward answer is that a statue exists for human appreciation, for the expression of beauty, for memory, political propaganda, or for ritual significance. The final cause is why someone ordered the statue, why the form and matter converge to serve a particular end in a particular time. For the seed, the final cause is more subtle but equally real in Aristotle's eyes. The seed's nature drives it toward flourishing as a plant, toward contributing to a larger ecological web, toward fulfilling its inherent telos as a part of the natural order. The final cause endows nature with direction. It explains not merely what a thing is, but why it exists as that kind of thing, what purpose its existence serves within a living cosmos. Aristotle's insistence that purpose can be found in nature runs through his reading of causation. If we observe a tree, we don't only see a collection of matter undergoing change, we see a process oriented toward a flourishing form. The final cause of the tree is not a mere human intention, but a natural end. The tree's flourishing, reproduction, its role in producing oxygen, shading a grove, providing habitat, offering fruit. The four causes taken together allow us to explain a thing's being and its becoming. The bronze statue's hour of creation can be traced through all four causes: the bronze as material, the design as form, the sculptor and the workshop as efficient cause, and the human appreciation and cultural function as final cause. The seed's journey from embryo to sapling to tree likewise can be traced through material cause, form, efficient cause, and final cause, each aspect clarifying how possibility becomes actuality. To see how these ideas animate concrete reasoning, consider a moment when you pass by a bronze statue in a park. You don't simply see a lump of metal, you see a figure with weight and balance, a posture that communicates meaning. You might notice the way the surface catches light, the particular region where the robe folds, the stance that suggests a story about a person or myth. You might wonder why this statue exists in this place and not elsewhere. The answer is not reducible to one factor. The material cause is the bronze, the raw stuff that has age and patina. The form is the statue's shape and the intended figure. The efficient cause is the sculptor's skill and the workshop's cooperation. The final cause is the intended effect on spectators, whether it be commemoration, wonder, or moral instruction. The statue then becomes a story told in metal, an artifact whose life as an object depends on a network of factors that Aristotle teaches us to analyze in a disciplined way. A seed making the leap to tree offers a parallel but with living, dynamic energy behind it. The seed's matter holds the genetic blueprint, the cytology and biochemistry that enable growth. The form is the plant's inherent nature, the sapling's capacity to become a typical oak or maple, to establish roots, to develop leaves that capture sunlight efficiently. The efficient cause is the cascade of cellular processes, hormonal signals, and environmental interactions, soil chemistry, moisture, temperature, microbial partners that propel germination, cell division, and organ formation. The final cause is the plant's telos, the flourishing of a life form that will reproduce, sustain itself, participate in an ecological neighborhood, and contribute to the biosphere's balance. In both cases, you can see how change is meaningful because it is directed, because it is guided by ends that are intelligible to us when we study the world carefully. Aristotle's view of knowledge is inseparable from this framework of causes. He is not satisfied with accounting for change in merely mechanical terms, but insists that knowledge must ground itself in experience and advance through demonstrative reasoning. Our knowledge begins with sense perception, with the data that come through the senses, but it does not stop there. We progress, by careful argument, to first principles that cannot be demonstrated in the same way as more particular propositions, yet are known to be true in a robust sense. From these first principles we construct demonstrations that show how general conclusions follow from necessary premises, and these demonstrations rest upon the four causes, strung together into a coherent story of why things are as they are. This is why Aristotle calls his approach scientific, not science in our modern sense of laboratories and experiments alone, but a rational, methodical pursuit that begins with experience and moves toward universals deduced by reason, while never abandoning the data of observation. In Aristotle's Metaphysics and Physics, this method becomes a way of explaining being in its most general sense. The metaphysical question, what is being, is answered by examining substances, causes, and form. Substances are the primary beings, things that stand alone and persist through change, things that can bear the attributes that appear and disappear. In his account, a horse or a statue is a substance, but beneath the surface of change lies a persistent something that makes it what it is. Substances are not just bundles of properties, they are the carriers of form, the actualization of potentialities. And because a substance can undergo accidents, changes in properties that do not alter its essential being, Aristotle's analysis helps us differentiate what is essential from what is incidental to a thing's existence. As he famously notes in the way he juxtaposes parts and wholes, the whole is prior to the parts in many important respects. A statue is not merely an aggregation of bronze lumps. It is a unity whose form integrates those parts into a single, meaningful object. This is the sense in which the whole is prior to the parts, not in the reductive sense to erase the importance of material substrata, but in the sense that form gives the unity that matter cannot by itself supply. As we trace how knowledge grows from sense experience toward demonstrative reasoning, we cross paths with Aristotle's own practical and pedagogical life. He is not an ivory-towered philosopher content with armchair speculation. He inhabits a living tradition of inquiry. The Lyceum, the school he founded in Athens, becomes the stage on which theory and observation mingle. He conducts walking conversations with his students, an image that has become famous, the peripatetic method, so called because the teachers walked about as they spoke of questions of nature, causation, and ethics. This is not merely a quaint anecdote, it reveals a deep epistemic stance. To study nature is to observe, question, and move together through problems, letting the body accompany the mind's movement toward insight. The walking is not a distraction but a technique for sustaining attention, for keeping the intellect engaged by the presence of the natural world around them. In the Lyceum, there was a disciplined rhythm of inquiry, one that could absorb a wide range of questions, from physics to biology to ethics, and to connect them with a single, coherent framework. Two historical anecdotes illuminate this living tradition. First, Aristotle's founding of the Lyceum and his cultivation of what some called the peripatetic school. It is easy to picture him in the Stoa or the shaded walkways of Athens, turning a discussion to the matter of change, then pausing to demonstrate a principle with a simple experiment or a mental experiment drawn from what they can observe that very day. The school became a hub for a robust tradition of inquiry that would shape Western thought for centuries. The second anecdote concerns Aristotle's tutoring of Alexander the Great. It is tempting to imagine a tutor shaping a future world conqueror, but more importantly, this relationship reveals Aristotle's broader project: to train the mind not only to grasp the world, but to act in it with a sense of order, of ends, of purposes that align with a life well lived. In both stories, we glimpse a philosopher who believed that knowledge must be useful, and that understanding the natural order could illuminate the direction of human action, politics, and leadership. Let us return to the two vivid, robust examples that anchor this inquiry: the bronze statue and the seed becoming a tree. Each example makes transparent how form, matter, and the four causes work in a way that is intelligible and testable in the ordinary world. In the statue, the material cause is the bronze, a metal that bears the marks of the sculptor's craft, the patina that will develop with time, the weight that anchors the figure in space, the sheen that invites our gaze. The formal cause is the statue's design, the proportions of the body, the musculature suggested by the folds of cloth, the expression that conveys a narrative or a value. The efficient cause is the sculptor's hand, the workshop environment, the chisels that carve, the heat that perhaps changes the metal's properties, the sequence of steps that gradually give shape to the vision. The final cause is the intended function: to memorialize, to inspire, to embody a virtue, to declare a political memory, to harmonize space with a human story. When we consider the statue through the lens of causes, we see how a change in any one component would alter the whole. Removing the form would not make a statue. Removing the material would erase the statue's possibility. Changing the efficient cause would result in a different work or no work at all. Altering the final cause, if the statue is intended to warn or admonish, would transform the very sense in which the object is meaningful. The seed's journey to a tree offers a living, dynamic counterpart. The seed's matter holds the genetic and cellular architecture that will unfold through time. The form is the plant's inherent telos, a blueprint that organizes growth. The arrangement of roots, stems, leaves, and reproductive organs tailored to its species. The efficient causes are a chorus of processes: seed germination triggered by warmth and moisture, cells dividing, tissues differentiating into roots that anchor and absorb, shoots that reach for light, stomata that regulate gas exchange, hormones that orchestrate timing. The final cause is the plant's purpose within the ecosystem and its own maturation: to become a functional organism that reproduces to carry the species forward, to contribute to soil structure and nutrient cycles, to become part of a habitat that supports other beings. In this seed-to-tree drama, we see how potentiality is not mere possibility, but an ordered tendency toward realization under favorable conditions. The final cause does not mean that the tree is consciously aiming at any end. Aristotle's claim is that nature is oriented toward ends, and living beings exhibit a kind of internal direction that yields recognizable outcomes. If we widen the circle, we can see Aristotle's metaphysical and epistemological claims as scaffolding for his broader program. To build a coherent account of nature, mind, and value that can inform later inquiries in physics, biology, and ethics. The four causes provide a framework for understanding physical change and natural teleology, while the claim that knowledge starts in experience and moves through demonstrative reasoning connects with a larger view of science as a disciplined pursuit of truths grounded in the world. In the very act of asking, why is this statue here? Why does this seed grow? We are already enacting the Aristotelian method. We attend to particulars, we separate out material conditions from form and end, and we test our understanding by tracing how changes in one component bear on the whole. To see how these ideas interact with the broader dialogue of philosophy, we must consider how Aristotle positions himself in relation to other grand thinkers who asked similar questions about being and knowledge. Plato, for example, insisted that the primary reality is not the sensible particular, but the enduring forms or ideas that underlie sensible things. For Plato, the world of appearances participates in a higher, more real order of forms that can truly be known only through philosophical assent, not through the rough and tumble of sense experience alone. Aristotle's counter-movement puts form on the side of the things themselves, not outside them as a separate realm. For Aristotle, the form of a statue is not an abstract, separate ideal. It is the form immanent in the matter that makes the statue what it is. In this sense, Aristotle returns philosophy to the world as it is known through experience, yet his form is not merely what the senses show us. It is what the thing is as a functioning unity. Democritus, with his atoms and the void, offers another stark contrast. The materialist of the pre-Socratic tradition emphasizes the discrete, indivisible units out of which all things are assembled. For Democritus, reality reduces to the arrangement of atoms in the void, and causation is largely mechanical in its scope. Aristotle's teleology, by contrast, maintains that things have an end or purpose that is not reducible to motion by external pushes alone. Yet Aristotle does not deny the role of matter or motion. He simply insists that to understand why a statue is a statue, we must attend to how matter and form cooperate to realize an end. The perennial debate about teleology is sharpened by these points of comparison: Plato's ideal forms versus Aristotle's immanent form, Democritus's atoms versus Aristotle's integrated, purpose-laden substances. In the modern era, critiques of teleology push Aristotle to clarify what exactly we mean when we speak of ends in nature. Immanuel Kant, for example, argued that our experience is necessarily structured by the mind's a priori intuitions and categories. He thought that the way we perceive space and time and causal relations among events is not something that we should ascribe to the things themselves, but to the conditions of our own knowing. From Kant's view, causal necessity is not something we discover in the world on its own, but something we impose as part of the mental framework that makes experience possible. If we bring Kant into Aristotle's discussion, we would note a profound tension. Aristotle wants to say that nature has ends and purposes, whereas Kant wants to insist that human cognition imposes categories that shape how we understand anything, including causal relations. In other words, Kant would challenge the straightforward application of Aristotelian final causes to the universe as a whole, insisting that we must be careful about projecting human-centered teleology onto natural processes. David Hume pushes the critique even further by skepticism about causal necessity. Hume would say that our inference from constant conjunction, seeing that it is always followed by B, does not demonstrate any essential necessity that connects it to B. The causal link, if there is one, is a product of habit and regularity rather than an explicit metaphysical necessity. In a sense, Hume challenges the very core of teleology by urging us to re-express causal explanations in terms of regular associations and observable regularities rather than in terms of final ends that nature itself aims at. Aristotle's four causes are, for Hume, a layer of speculation beyond what we can observe with the senses. Yet the living practice of scientific inquiry often uses teleology as a heuristic rather than a metaphysical claim. We often describe biological functions in teleological language. The heart pumps blood for the sake of circulating it, and then translate those statements into mechanical descriptions of processes and selection pressures that explain why such functions exist. This translation is a modern concession to Humean caution and Kantian caution alike. We may talk about ends for explanatory and communicative purposes, but we may not commit ourselves to ends as metaphysical realities in nature. In the natural sciences today, Darwin's theory of natural selection offers a powerful corrective to naive teleology. The apparent ends of organisms, their capacity to survive and reproduce, are best understood as outcomes of blind, impersonal processes that conferring advantage through differential reproduction. There is no conscious designer endowing each organism with a purpose, yet we still speak of functions and ends because the language of teleology captures patterns that science explains through history and function. The modern view often returns to a form of teleology that resembles Aristotle's in spirit but not in metaphysical commitment. We use goal-directed language as a tool of explanation because it effectively captures the behavior of living systems, while the underlying mechanisms are understood through causal histories, selection pressures, and emergent properties. This move does not discard Aristotelian insights, but reinterprets them in light of contemporary biology and philosophy of science. To connect Aristotle's foundations with his broader project, we should also notice how his metaphysical and epistemological commitments illuminate his ethical and political thought. In the Nicomachean Ethics, the final cause of human life, the good for a human being, is a moving, dynamic telos that frames how we determine virtue and happiness. If the good life itself serves as the final cause of human action, then the study of nature and knowledge becomes not merely a theoretical enterprise, but a practical enterprise aimed at shaping character and society. The idea that nature has ends resonates with Aristotle's claim that the good is that at which all things aim. This phrase, found in his ethical writings, captures the sense in which nature's ends provide orientation. It also helps explain why the ancient philosopher insisted on education and habit as means of cultivating a rational and virtuous life, for such cultivation aligns human beings with their natural ends. As we reflect on the interplay of being, knowing, and value in Aristotle's philosophy, we can see the enduring appeal of his approach. The insistence that to understand anything we must attend to substance, to the material structural basis of things, to the form that gives them identity, to the processes by which they come into being, and to the ends that give life its practical orientation. The four causes do not merely classify causes for curiosity's sake. They provide a dynamic framework that makes sense of change, unity, and purpose in a world of complexity. The seeds he invites us to watch under a window or the sculptures in the public square become, in his hands, case studies for a comprehensive vision of reality, one that ties the most intimate details of a plant's growth to the grand questions of what it means to be, to know, and to live well. Let us now pause to consider how this section invites us to cultivate a particular kind of reflective practice. Aristotle's approach is not to preach a doctrine about what must be true in every case, but to offer a method that invites careful observation, disciplined reasoning, and an openness to revision in light of evidence. He asks us to examine everyday objects with care, to ask what they are made of, what form they carry, how their substance came to be, and why they exist as they do in their environment. He invites us to consider the continuity between living things and inanimate artifacts, suggesting that both reveal an intelligible economy of causes. Such inquiry makes visible a continuity between science and virtue, because the same orientation toward understanding can guide not only how we discuss nature, but how we live within it. To bring these reflections into a more practical frame, consider a modern classroom or a contemporary laboratory. Students and researchers begin with observation, watching how a plant grows, how a sculpture's surfaces catch light, how a mechanism operates. They test hypotheses by tracing dependencies among material conditions and functional roles, much as Aristotle did when he asked, for example, what is the matter of a statue, and what is the form that makes it a statue? In their experiments, they identify efficient causes, the agents responsible for change, and they ask about final causes, what end does the system serve or accomplish? Do the parts of a machine work to sustain a certain performance or a system operate toward an objective beyond themselves? And as in biology and physics alike, the four-cause framework helps professionals articulate explanations that are simultaneously descriptive and normative, explanatory and evaluative. Not simply what happens, but why it matters for purposes we value. It is worth listening for the voices of Aristotle's own words in these moments, to hear the cadence of his thought in his original style. He begins with a broad invitation, that learning is a process of inquiry into why things are as they are, a process that begins with what we can see and proceeds to what we can demonstrate. He writes in his characteristic, compact manner that the act of knowing begins with the experience of particular things and proceeds through reasoning to universal principles. He also emphasizes a crucial point about knowledge itself. It is not mere opinion, it is grounded, justified, and demonstrable. In De Anima, he articulates the idea that the soul is the form of the body, the first actuality of a living body, which allows a living being to act and sense. This claim is not just about psychology, it is a formulation about how life differentiates itself from inert matter and how mind integrates with body. In the Nicomachean Ethics, he makes a link between the good and the ends toward which all things strive, a teleological thread that follows from his underlying metaphysical commitments. And in the Metaphysics, he presses the question of what it means to say that a thing has being in the first place, what counts as substance, and how form and matter cohere into a unified reality. Throughout the discussion, Aristotle remains attentive to counterarguments and to the possibility of revision in light of new questions. He is not a dogmatist who imposes an all-encompassing doctrine. He is a methodical rationalist who invites continued inquiry. His method invites us to cross-examine familiar ideas by comparing them with alternate accounts. Plato's theory of forms, for example, invites us to consider whether a separate realm of perfect patterns is required to explain why things are the way they are. Aristotle's response is to insist that form can be understood as an immanent principle within the thing itself. The tree's growth is guided by its own nature. It does not require a separate domain of forms to explain its development. Yet this is precisely the kind of question that invites further reflection. What is the status of universals in Aristotle's scheme? He maintains that universals are instantiated in substances as forms that articulate ways of being, but he also recognizes that human thought often abstracts from particular instances to reach general propositions. This tension between the particular and the universal, between the sensible and the intelligible, remains a living issue in the history of philosophy and a source of cross-references that deepen one's study of the big questions. We can also reflect on how Aristotle's four causes illuminate technological and social change in our world today. In engineering or architecture, we might discuss a bridge in terms of its material composition, steel and concrete, its design, the arch as a form of load distribution, the processes by which it was built, construction methods and labor, and its purpose, facilitating transport, enabling communities to connect. The same framework applies to a software system, where the code, the architecture, the developer's work, and the intended functions of the program work together to explain how the system exists now and how it might evolve. In cultural life, the statue in the park, the painting, or the monument all reveal a complex interplay of matter, form, human agency, and intended meaning. Aristotle's insistence on looking for causes at multiple levels equips us to read artifacts and institutions with greater sensitivity, to see not just what they are but how they came to be and what ends they serve in the lives of communities. If you have ever paused to ask in your own life why something seems to be the way it is, you have already glimpsed the Aristotelian project. When we ask why an object's existence matters, we are asking about its final cause in practice, even if we do not use that phrase in our ordinary speech. If you study a bicycle, you might wonder about its material components, its frame's shape, the assembly process that produced it, and the functions it is meant to fulfill for a rider. You are performing a kind of causal analysis that Aristotle would recognize as a living manifestation of philosophy in action. The same goes for everyday experiences, why a meal is prepared the way it is, why a novel or film is structured as it is, why a city block is laid out with particular forms of space and movement. Aristotle's framework offers a lens through which to view the world with clarity and depth, a lens that anchors abstract metaphysical claims to practical interpretation and everyday perception. In closing, let us hold two questions before us as we continue this journey through metaphysics, epistemology, and the philosophy of living things. First, what is the nature of being, if being is best understood as substance, and if substances are composites of matter and form? How do potentiality and actuality illuminate the path from what can be to what is, from possibility to realized life in both inanimate and living things? Second, how do the four causes guide us in a world of rapid change, where technology, science, and culture repeatedly reframe what we think counts as an explanation for why things are the way they are. If we keep these questions in mind and return to the two enduring images that opened our meditation, the bronze statue and the growing seed, we will discover that Aristotle's foundations are not relics of an ancient mind but living tools for thinking about the world at the pace of our own lives. And so we continue with patience and curiosity to examine the everyday as if it were a map of the cosmos. We listen for the voices of the past, Plato, Democritus, Kant, Hume, Darwin, and we hear in their debates the same stubborn impulse to understand why things are as they are. We follow Aristotle in the footsteps of the Lyceum, walking together as questions unfold and answers open like leaves after rain. We test our own understanding against the glow of a bronze statue in sunlight and the quiet vigor of a seed breaking through soil. The inquiry is not finished, and it should not be. Every object, every process, every life carries within it a text waiting to be read, a chain of causes waiting to be traced, and a telos waiting to be recognized. If we allow ourselves the discipline and the wonder to attend to such things, we may find that the foundations of being, substance, form, matter, potentiality, actuality, and the four causes, offer not a final system but a living method. A way of looking at the world with a patient eye, a careful hand, and a mind ready to accompany change with understanding. As Aristotle tells us through his own practice and his own patience, to know is to see how things are together, and to see how things are together is to glimpse, in a single moment of attention, why things are at all. In the quiet space of a room lit by morning light, imagine Aristotle asking us to pause not to calculate, but to consider what it means to live well. He does not begin with a theorem to be proven to skeptics, but with a question that surfaces in the ordinary hours of a life. What is the good life for a human being, and how do we arrive at it? This section invites you to walk with him along a road that unfolds through habit and choice, through training of the soul and the discipline of reason, toward a life that is robustly human. We will speak of eudaimonia, the good life, the flourishing life, not as a glittering single moment, but as an ongoing activity, a form of life, a continuous craft of being. We will explore virtue as a mean achieved by habituation, guided by practical wisdom or phronses. We will attend to the social texture that makes virtue not merely a private posture, but a public and relational art. And we will test the ideas against questions that have haunted moral philosophy from antiquity to today. Are there universal rules that can guide action, or must virtue always bow to context? Is virtue a sound criterion across cultures, or must it bend under the pressure of competing goods? Can a theory of virtue still matter in a world of plural loyalties, conflicting duties, and uncertain futures? To begin, we must ground ourselves in the first principles Aristotle offers. He begins, as many readers know, with a sweeping claim about the aim of human life. Everything we do, every craft, every inquiry, every choice is undertaken with some good at which it aims. The most comprehensive form of that claim is the assertion that the good for humans is the activity of the soul in accordance with virtue. This is not a mere summation of clever actions, but the acknowledgement that virtue grounds the whole of life. The good life in his telling is not a static state one might stumble upon by chance. It is a kind of ongoing performance, the rational activity of our soul in a way that expresses our excellence. It is, to echo his well-known formulation, a life lived in accordance with virtue. When we hear that phrase, the good for man is an activity of the soul in accordance with virtue, we are being pointed toward a sense in which flourishing is an ongoing practice, a disciplined way of being rather than a single peak experience. The aim is not merely to feel good in the moment, it is to enact goodness in a reliable and recognizable way over the course of a lifetime. To understand how Aristotle thinks we achieve this, we must follow his account of virtue as a mean, a balance that sits between two extremes, one of excess and one of deficiency. If the good is the practice of the rational soul in proper measure, then virtue itself takes shape as that mean appropriate to us as rational beings in particular situations. It is not a dull arithmetic middle that holds in every context. Rather, the mean is relative to the person and to the circumstances at hand, guided by reason and the judgment of a prudent person. The classic formulation in his Ethics is precise. Virtue is a state of character lying in a mean, the mean being determined by practical wisdom, and this is because the right action is inseparable from the right framing of the situation by someone who knows how to choose well. Put differently, virtue is not about following an external rule that applies identically everywhere. It is about cultivating a responsive, discerning stance toward life that lets us calibrate action to the complexities of living well. And if we ask what guides that calibration, Aristotle points to phronses, practical wisdom. This is not abstract knowledge or the theoretical grasp of a universal principle. It is the know-how of choosing rightly under the particular conditions of a given moment. Phronses, in Aristotle's vocabulary, is the practical intelligence that allows a person to discern what is the right mean in a given circumstance. It is the kind of wisdom that a good judge of life would demonstrate, the capacity to take in relevant features of a situation, to weigh potential harms and benefits, to consider the character that is developing, and to see not only what would be effective in the moment, but what would be conducive to long-term flourishing. It is a wisdom that is exercised through habit and through reflection, trained by experience and guided by reason. Thus Phronses anchors virtue. It makes the mean not an abstract prescription, but a living, adaptable standard. The relationship between virtue and external goods deserves careful attention. Aristotle does not grant that virtue can prosper in isolation from the good things of life. He acknowledges that the virtuous person will be capable of enjoying and using external goods, wealth, health, friends, status, without letting those goods govern the soul. In one famous line he notes that virtue, while it is the essential center of the good life, does not exist in a vacuum. The right use of external goods can support or frustrate virtue, depending on how we relate to them. A certain material condition can help or hinder the expression of virtuous character. It is possible to be virtuous without these goods, but not possible to flourish toward eudaimonia without some reasonable provision for a life of shared social existence. The point is not to set external goods in opposition to virtue, but to remind ourselves that human beings are social animals, embedded in a web of relationships and institutions that shape what counts as a fitting life for us. The social dimension of virtue is therefore central in Aristotle's account. The good life is not merely a solitary ascent of the soul, but a life acculturated in the polis or city and in the myriad practices that animate human communities. Education plays a decisive role in this process because habituation, repeated actions that become dispositions, forms character. The young are formed through persistent training. The stories they hear, the models they imitate, the rules they learn, the rhythms of daily life that discipline impulse and desire. Virtue grows not by solitary self-will, but by being embedded in social practices that reward temperance, courage, generosity, honesty, and the rest. Plato's Republic and Laches may be read as conversations about the same moral horizon from different angles, but Aristotle's insistence on habituation emphasizes the long arc of character development rather than a sudden conversion or a single act of moral triumph. Character, in his view, is something that gradually becomes reliable through the repeated performance of virtuous acts. Let us pause with some concrete illustrations that bring this theory to life. Courage, for Aristotle, sits between two vices, rashness on one side and cowardice on the other. The brave person faces fear appropriately, neither ignoring danger when caution is prudent nor overreacting with reckless bravado when prudence would demand restraint. Consider a firefighter who runs toward a burning building not because danger is thrilling, but because the duty to rescue is clear and the risk weighed against the good. The courageous person does not become heroic in every moment. There are times when stepping back, when retreat, when seeking more information is the wise mean. In ordinary life, this means a sober posture in the face of risk, someone who tells the truth about a difficult situation even when it might implicate them, yet who might with tact and sensitivity choose a safer or more prudent way to convey bad news to a vulnerable listener. It is a matter of balance that preserves the integrity of action in the face of fear or risk. Generosity offers another vivid example. The virtuous person gives what is necessary in the right degree to the right people at the right time and for the right reasons. Generosity lies between wastefulness and stinginess. If one gives too little, one fails to recognize the needs and dignities of others. If one gives too much, one may neglect one's own duties to sustain the health of one's own life, or undermine one's own stability and future capacity to help others. The virtuous person will give with discernment, supporting a friend who is in genuine need, but not succumbing to a constant overreaching generosity that empties one's resources and undermines one's own obligations to family or community. The mean here is not a fixed dollar amount, but a proportion that respects context. The one offering help shares resources in a way that strengthens the person helped and maintains one's own ability to help again in the future. Truthfulness is another domain where the mean matters. Truthfulness involves speaking in ways that are accurate and honest while resisting both the vice of bluntness and the vice of deception. The virtuous person tells the truth when truth-telling serves the good and refrains when truth-telling would cause unnecessary harm or break an important trust. In such judgments, practical wisdom becomes essential, because the correct decision about what to reveal and how to phrase it depends on context, relationship, and anticipated consequences. Temperance, the restraint of appetite and desire, offers a parallel illustration. It is a mean between overindulgence and insensibility. The temperate person enjoys pleasures in a way that is harmonious with health and long-term well-being, rather than giving in to excess or repressing natural desires in a way that impoverishes life. These examples are not mere case studies. They are invitations to see how virtue operates as a cultivated mode of response to living itself. In thinking about how such dispositions are formed and sustained, Aristotle's account of education and habituation becomes crucial. Virtue arises from repeated action, a phrase that sounds almost simple, but which carries a deep ontological and psychological claim. Repetition tunes the will and shapes desire. If a child, or an adult for that matter, practices brave actions, generous acts, and truthful speech in a family, school, or civic setting, those practices carve into the person a reflex to respond in similar ways when confronted with new occasions. The education of virtue, then, is not merely the transfer of abstract rules. It is the shaping of character through stories, through demonstrations of noble actions, through communities that reward virtuous behavior, and through legal and social norms that align personal interest with the common good. The student becomes the kind of person who naturally makes the right choice not because a rule compels them, but because their own character has learned to recognize and seek the good in particular circumstances. The social dimension of virtue also includes the role of friendship and community in shaping character. Aristotle devotes significant attention to friendship not as a private comfort, but as a practical and moral institution that sustains the life of virtue. In the Nicomachean Ethics, friendship is not merely a sentiment but a form of practical arrangement by which virtue is tested, reinforced, and enriched. The virtuous person seeks friends who will help them become better citizens, who will support them in pursuing the mean, and who will challenge their biases and temptations. In friendship, there is exchange of mutual aid, dialogue about what counts as good, and opportunities to practice justice in the social sphere. The cultivation of friendship contributes to the development of character because it provides settings in which virtuous action can be tempted, examined, and refined. A life of virtue in this sense is a life lived in a web of meaningful relationships, in which shared practices, shared goods, and shared obligations help the individual to maintain the right balance. We must also consider the limits of virtue in light of external circumstances. The social dimension of virtue means that the distribution of resources, access to education, and the opportunities afforded by a community shape how easily a person can live virtuously. Aristotle acknowledges that a robust virtue is easier to cultivate in a context that affords goods such as health, education, security, and a certain degree of material stability. The question of external goods is not a negation of virtue, but an invitation to recognize how fragile virtue can be in the absence of supportive social structures. If the city is corrupt or if the family environment is unstable, the path to virtue becomes more arduous, requiring more deliberate and persistent practice to overcome adverse conditions. Hence, while virtue can be practiced anywhere, some environments provide richer soil than others for the cultivation of character. As we move from theory to practice, we should ask, how does Aristotle imagine decision-making in the face of moral uncertainty? In real life, we rarely have a clean textbook problem with a single correct answer and a tally of pros and cons. We are often confronted with ambiguous cases where the right course defies simple categorization. Here Phronsie comes into its own. The prudent person endowed with practical wisdom is not simply a knower of rules. They are a discriminating agent who feels the pull of various goods, who understands what is at stake for the person involved, who discerns the right balance among competing claims, and who acts in accordance with what the situation most demands. This does not exempt us from seeking guidance or from reflecting on our motives. Rather, it anchors moral decision-making in the reality of lived life. Phronsie asks us to learn from our own past actions, to scrutinize the outcomes of those actions, to examine our character under pressure, and to adjust our future actions accordingly. It is the art of deciding what is the right mean when the world offers slippery gradients rather than bright, binary choices. Two kinds of challenges to virtue ethics deserve particular attention in our conversations about Aristotle. The first is the charge that virtue ethics lacks universal, action-guiding rules. If virtue is a mean relative to us and determined by the prudent person, then some worry arises. What happens when we encounter a dilemma where one virtuous impulse seems to demand lying in order to prevent harm, or where courage seems to require an act that external rules would condemn? If there is no single agreed rule that applies in every case, how can we be confident that virtue ethics provides a reliable algorithm for moral life? Aristotle's reply would be to insist that the goal of virtue is not to generate a list of universal commands, but to cultivate a stable soul that can discern the appropriate response in the many particularities of life. The mean is an aimworthy orientation rather than a strict directive. Yet, he does offer guidance in other parts of the corpus, such as the notion that we should not choose actions that are unconcerned with the good or that fail to respect the dignity of others. The prudent person will almost always favor truth-telling, fairness, and respect for neighbor, unless a higher reason dictates otherwise. In other words, the universalist would need to translate Aristotle's emphasis on context into guidelines that hold across many situations. Virtues should be practiced in ways that preserve human flourishing and the shared life in communities that norms and laws support. The second challenge comes from concerns about cultural relativity or potential conflicts between virtues in real situations. If different cultures or communities place different emphases on what counts as the mean, or if two virtues seem to pull in opposite directions in a given moment, can virtue ethics still function as a robust guide to action? Aristotle's response to this challenge would foreground the role of rational judgment and the social constraints of communities that have cultivated reasoned deliberation about the good. The mean, though relative to us, is still anchored in rational assessment by a prudent person. That means there is room for legitimate disagreement about particular cases, but not a license to abandon the aim of human flourishing. And if two virtues appear to conflict, the virtue of phronses helps to adjudicate between them by appeals to the context, the sailor's chart that uses knowledge of the sea to navigate, so to speak. In practice, the conflict of virtues is not the end of moral life, but a prompt to reflect, discuss, and revise one's approach in light of experience and the welfare of the community. To illuminate these issues across time, we can trace a continuity of thought from Aristotle through his successors, and see how the seeds of his ethics took root and grew into different forms. In the early Platonic milieu, Socrates and his interlocutors pushed toward a persistent question: can virtue be taught? In the dialogues that survive, Protagoras, Meno, Euthyphro, and others, the dramatic interactions reveal a concern with whether virtue is a form of knowledge, a kind of habit, or a craft of excellence that can be passed on. The Socratic method, asking, probing, exposing ignorance, urging coherence, becomes a method of moral education that resonates with Aristotle's insistence on habituation and training. The confrontation in these Platonic dialogues is not merely about who is right and who is wrong. It is about how we come to understand what virtue is and how we come to live by it. Socrates challenges the claim that virtue is simply a matter of feeling or loyalty to custom, forcing an examination of whether virtue corresponds to a rational account of the good. Though Aristotle would later distinguish himself from Socratic skepticism about the sufficiency of know-how, he would also take on board the crucial lesson that moral life requires careful reflection and persistent practice, not merely the possession of a few pious maxims. From the ancient conversation with Plato, we move to a later, more deliberate transformation: the Stoics' reinterpretation of virtue and the good life in a framework that asks how one should live in the face of fate and circumstance. The Stoics, such as Zeno, Cleinias, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius, place virtue at the center of a life well lived, but they pivot toward a stricter view of what is under our control. For them, external goods, wealth, health, reputation, are indifferents, not inherently valuable for the good life. What matters are the internal goods of virtue and the alignment of one's will with the rational order of the cosmos. The discipline of the mind becomes a training that invites a certain serenity and resilience, to accept what one cannot change, to exercise one's will to assent or dissent to appearances, and to maintain rational alignment even when the world around one is hostile. The Stoic dignity, while sharing with Aristotle a commitment to virtue and to the idea that virtue is sufficient for happiness, departs in its emphasis on the unassailability of virtue in the face of fortune and its more radical claim that only virtue is truly good. This is not a direct replication of Aristotle's mean, but a robust, self-contained ethics in which habituation, rational judgment, and the aim of living in accordance with nature become the basis of a disciplined, purposeful life. Medieval commentators, most notably Thomas Aquinas, absorbed Aristotle's ethics into a Christian framework, asking how classical virtues, courage, temperance, justice, prudence, could be harmonized with faith and grace. Aquinas did not abandon the Aristotelian picture of virtue as a kind of excellence of the soul, but he reframed the telos as rooted in the divine law and the ultimate end of human life in God. In his synthesis, natural virtue remains essential. Prudence, the intellectual virtue corresponding to phronses, justice, temperance, and fortitude, are still the four cardinal virtues that organize the moral life. Yet these are ordered toward the ultimate good of union with God, and their activities are illumined by theological virtues such as faith, hope, and charity. The medieval augmentation of Aristotle's ethics thus preserves the core insight, the importance of character, the central role of reason in guiding action, and the social dimension of virtue, while expanding its horizon to include a transcendent end. In this sense, Aristotle's ethics do not disappear in the medieval period. They are reinterpreted, extended, and creatively integrated into new theological and philosophical disciplines. In modern times, we see the lineage of Aristotelian virtue ethics in new forms that raise fresh questions and find new audiences. The 20th and 21st century revival of virtue ethics in the hands of philosophers such as Elizabeth Anscombe, Philippa Foot, Alasdair MacIntyre, and Rosalind Hursthouse has been both a rehabilitation and a reconfiguration of Aristotle's ideas. They emphasize the importance of character, intention, and the cultivation of virtues as central to moral life, often in response to deontological and consequentialist approaches that foreground rules or calculations. MacIntyre's influential critique in After Virtue argues that moral philosophy fragmented into competing theories that lost sight of the virtue-centered approach that characterizes the great traditions of ethical thought, including Aristotle's. Contemporary virtue ethicists insist that to judge actions, we must attend to the kind of person who would perform them and to the pattern of life in which these actions occur. They also engage with issues of moral uncertainty, cross-cultural variation, and the modern world's pluralism, questions that echo the ancient strands of thought but demand new resources and phrasing. We can turn to a few brief, concrete cross-references to primary texts to illuminate this continuity and difference. Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics in Book I lays out the teleology of human life and the central claim that the good for man is activity of the soul in accordance with virtue. In Book II, he introduces the doctrine of the mean and the argument that virtue is formed by habituation, so that character becomes a stable and reliable guide to action. In Book VI, he gives us the fullest treatment of practical wisdom. Through phronses, one learns to discern the right means in the face of competing goods and the unique demands of particular situations. In Book I, he emphasizes that the good is not reducible to wealth, pleasure, or honor, for these are only desirable insofar as they serve the ultimate end of human flourishing. In Book X, he considers happiness as the contemplative life, but also as a virtuous life socially engaged, praising the life of study and of noble action in the polis. The classical tradition did not end with Aristotle or with the Stoics. It extended into Christian philosophy and modern moral thought through a chain of influence that deserves careful attention. Plato's dialogues trace the early tension between moral knowledge and moral character. In the Republic, for example, the exercise of virtue and the formation of the soul occur within a political order designed to guide people toward the good. Socrates in the Platonic dialogues challenges conventional wisdom about virtue's content and its teachability, pressing for an account that would endure under reasoned scrutiny. In the faces of his interlocutors, we glimpse the early debates about whether virtue is a form of knowledge or a matter of feeling and habit. The Socratic confrontations are not simply episodes of argument. They are pedagogical events, demonstrations of how moral life is learned through criticism, examination, and the patient construction of sense. In the Stoic appropriation of Aristotle's ethics, the focus shifts to the inner life and the sufficiency of virtue for happiness. If Aristotle asks how to live well given the world as it is, the Stoics ask how to live well in the face of a world that includes many things beyond our control. The Stoics insist that virtue alone is sufficient for happiness. External conditions, wealth, health, reputation, are indifferent. Yet even with this radical stance, we can hear the echoes of Aristotle in the call for prudent action and the insistence that rational understanding of nature guides how one acts. The moral life for the Stoic is a disciplined alignment with rational nature, a training in safeguarding the inner freedom of the soul against the shocks of fortune. Translating this into real-world practice, we can examine how Aristotle's virtues function within family life, workplaces, and public institutions. Courage informs leadership in crisis, where the right move is neither recklessness nor timidity, but a decision that protects the vulnerable and upholds the common good. Generosity structures charitable response within communities that enable members to respond to one another's needs without enabling dependency or eroding one's own capacity to help again. Truthfulness sustains trust in institutions and in interpersonal relationships. It requires discernment about what is appropriate to reveal and what should remain within the bounds of tact or confidentiality. Temperance moderates appetites that threaten to overwhelm judgment or damage the body and mind. Each virtue in practice is tested not in abstraction, but in the tough realities of daily life. In parenting, in professional ethics, in civic obligations, in the care of the elderly, and in the management of conflict. In light of these considerations, Aristotle's Ethics remains a living resource for contemporary ethical reflection. It offers a robust alternative to the view that moral life is simply a matter of following rules, or of maximizing outcomes, or of surrendering to cultural fashion. It invites us to imagine a life in which character is cultivated as a steady project, in which reason's authority is exercised not to dampen the passions into silence, but to harmonize them with the good. It teaches that our best responses to the world are not merely rational calculations in insurance-like terms, but judgments rooted in a sense of what it means to flourish as a human being in a shared world. And it asks us to consider the social architecture that makes such flourishing possible: education that forms conscience, laws that reward just action, friendships that sustain virtue, and communities that provide meaningful opportunities to practice the moral life. Let us now turn to two short historical anecdotes that illuminate these ideas in striking ways. The first is the Socratic confrontation that occurs in the Platonic dialogues, which, although ancient in date, crystallizes tensions that persist in ethical discourse today. In the dialogue known as Meno, Socrates confronts the young and ambitious Meno with a foundational question: can virtue be taught? The exchange unfolds like a careful dismantling of assumptions, with Socrates insisting that if virtue could be taught, then there would be teachers of virtue and pupils who become virtuous through instruction. Yet Socrates challenges the very premise that virtue is simply a craft one can pass on, as a ship's manual can be passed to a new crew. The conversation moves into the ground of knowledge. What is virtue, and can one define it in a way that holds under cross-examination? Meno offers various definitions: wisdom, virtue as justice, virtue as a form of power, only to have each definition tested and found lacking. The point Socrates makes through elenchus, through the gentle art of question and counterexample, is that virtue is not reducible to a single recipe or a bare belief. It is a form of knowledge and disposition that demands unity, coherence, and a living sense of the good. The audience is left with a sense of the moral life as something to be learned, refined, and defended through steady practice, argument, and the slow process of self-examination. We see in this intervention a mirror of Aristotle's own insistence that virtue requires habituation and practical understanding. The confrontation reveals that moral education demands more than information. It requires transformation in the orientation of the soul toward what is good. A second anecdote concerns the later reception of Aristotle's Ethics within the philosophical tradition, especially its influence on the Stoics and medieval commentators. The Stoics, as we noted, recast virtue as the only good, with an emphasis on living in accordance with nature and the rational order of the cosmos. Their practical wisdom addresses the very questions Aristotle treats: how to act justly, how to endure misfortune, and how to maintain serenity in the face of external change. Yet they push to a more austere position about the insignificance of external goods for happiness. The encounter between Aristotle's mean and the Stoic emphasis on internal sovereignty yields a fruitful dialogue about how to balance human vulnerability with moral resilience. In the medieval world, Aquinas undertakes a synthesis that preserves Aristotle's ascent to virtue while clothing it in a theological frame. Prudence becomes an anchor of moral action in a life oriented toward God. The cardinal virtues, fortitude, temperance, justice, and prudence, become the structural pillars of moral psychology, while theological virtues add a different director's sense to the compass. This cross-cultural and cross-temporal conversation shows that Aristotle's ethical project did not end with his own semester of reflections. It endured as a living tradition capable of absorbing critique, recasting arguments, and remaining relevant to new questions about citizenship, law, and the good life. In thinking about the modern interpretation of virtue ethics, we should turn to contemporary thinkers who are continuing the conversation that Aristotle began 2.5 millennia ago. Rosalind Hursthaus's On Virtue Ethics approach, for example, foregrounds character over rule-based ethics, arguing that right actions flow from a virtuous character and that the moral life is best understood as the expression of a well-formed life, a life that exhibits moral virtue consistently. Christine Korsgaard's Kantian-inflected critiques and the responses from virtue theorists offer a dialogue about the place of motivation, rational moral agency, and the importance of character in ethical evaluation. Alasdair MacIntyre's critique of modern moral philosophy and After Virtue invites us to understand how moral language and practice have become fragmented in a secular culture, and he argues for a return to a narrative, virtue-centered account of human life that makes sense of communities, traditions, and shared practices in moral education. Contemporary virtue ethics also engages with questions of social justice, identity, and cross-cultural understanding, asking how a theory of virtue can accommodate plural values while preserving the aim of human flourishing. In this sense, Aristotle's ethics presides not as a fossil, but as a living tradition that has been adapted, revised, and clarified in response to the challenges of modern life. We might close with a meditation on how to translate these ideas into concrete practice in our daily lives. Aristotle's ethics invites us to cultivate the pupil of conscience, to train ourselves in discernment, to seek the mean in our actions, and to rely on the guidance of practical wisdom in times of moral uncertainty. It invites us to reflect on the kinds of communities in which we live, the kinds of education we provide for our children, the formation of friendships that can sustain us in morally challenging moments, and the ways in which public life, laws, institutions, and social expectations either supports or undermines the cultivation of virtue. The path to the good life in his telling is not found by mistake or by sudden conversion, but by patient, deliberate practice, act after act, habit after habit, until the soul's dispositions align with the demands of reason and the calls of justice, temperance, courage, and kindness. To put the matter plainly, Aristotle's ethics asks us to imagine a life in which our character becomes a reliable guide to action, a life in which the right action arises not from mere rule, but from deep, practiced understanding of what is good for a human being in a human world. It invites us to see our daily choices as moments in a longer drama, the drama of becoming good through living well. It asks us to recognize the social texture of virtue, to see education as the shaping of character, and to understand friendship as a practical training ground for virtue. It asks us to confront uncertainty with the right kind of intelligence, not blind obedience to a fixed rule, but a thoughtful, conscientious balancing of goods in light of the entire life we lead. And it invites us to listen for the voice of the prudent person who, in every situation, would determine the mean by reason and by compassion, who would recognize that honesty matters in the long arc of trust, and that courage matters in the long arc of solidarity. As a final reflection, consider how the ancient questions live on in the ordinary decisions you face today. Suppose you are offered a promotion that requires compromising a value you hold dear. You might be told that the path to advancement is to bend the truth in small ways or to overlook certain ethical concerns for the sake of efficiency. Aristotle would invite you to search for the mean that honors your commitments to truth and to fairness, while recognizing the need to balance competing goods, the good of the organization, the well-being of colleagues, and the integrity of your own character. Suppose you are confronted with a friend who needs help, but your own resources are stretched thin. The virtuous response would be to assess what you can give without undermining your own obligations or your future capacity to assist again. It would be a matter not of calculating exact amounts, but of discerning the right proportion in context, guided by phronses and shaped by the relationships that bind you to others. Suppose you face a conflict between loyalty to family and loyalty to a broader community. Here the prudent person must weigh duties, consider the impact of actions on the vulnerable, and seek a path that preserves both justice and care. In each case, Aristotle's insistence on the mean, habituation, and practical wisdom supplies a language and a method for living well amid complexity. The journey we have described, from the initial claim that the good life is the activity of the soul in accordance with virtue, through the elaboration of the mean and habituation, to the social and educational dimensions and the conversations with Platonists, Stoics, and medieval commentators, frames ethics as a practice rather than a theory that can be mastered by calculation alone. It is a practice in which virtue does not stand still but grows through practice and reflection. It is a practice in which a life of character coheres with reason and with affection, with justice and with friendship, with self-control and with courage, with honesty and with generosity. It is a practice that remains relevant today precisely because it does not pretend to offer a single recipe that works in every situation. It offers a cultivated capacity to see, judge, and act in ways that are fitting to our human life as a whole. In this sense, the art of living that Aristotle describes is a form of art that everyone can learn, though it demands patience, humility, and a daily commitment to grow. It invites us to pay attention to our own formation, to the stories we tell ourselves about what matters, to the habits we cultivate in our daily routines, to the communities that sustain or erode our capacity for virtue, and to the choices we make when the weight of the moment presses on us. If we accept that the good life is not a moment of triumph but a steady practice, then we can begin to see ethics as a craft that can be learned and refined in our schools, in our families, in our workplaces, and in the common life of our cities. It is not a cold set of rules, it is a living, shared project of becoming better human beings together. Throughout these reflections, we have remained attentive to the crosscurrents of thought that shape Aristotle's ethics and its reception. We have listened for the echo of Socratic questions that challenge us to articulate the meaning of virtue itself. We have followed the Stoic insistence that virtue, rightly understood, is sufficient for happiness, even as we recognize Aristotle's richer sense of the interdependence of virtue and the city, of temperance and justice, of practical wisdom and moral imagination. We have wandered through the medieval synthesis that makes virtue a bridge between reason and faith, a bridge that both preserves the Aristotelian core and invites a richer spiritual horizon. And we have trodden into the modern debates about rule following and global moral variation, where Aristotle's emphasis on context and character offers both caution and hope. Caution against the lure of universalizable shortcuts that will fail when tested by real life, and hope that the cultivation of virtue can provide a stable ground for moral judgment in a pluralistic era. If you take away one line from this tour, let it be this: virtue is not a phenomenon of isolated acts but a form of life. It is not merely something one does, it is something one becomes. The mean is not a fixed law carved into marble but a living discipline that speaks through the mouth of the prudent agent who, in each moment, makes a decision that reflects both the integrity of the person and the welfare of the world around them. The path of practical wisdom is a route through uncertainty, a craft of balance that honors the complexity of life and seeks not to dominate life with rule or appetite, but to harmonize them under the disciplined sovereignty of reason and friendship. If we can inhabit that vocation, Aristotle's ethics invites us into a way of living that remains as demanding as it is enduring. The art of living well as the art of becoming good, day after day, with care for the person we are and for the world we share. The idea at the heart of Aristotle's political thought is deceptively simple to state, and in that simplicity lies the power to unsettle our most stubborn intuitions about society, freedom, and the good life. Human beings, Aristotle tells us, are not solitary by nature but social by birth. We are by nature political animals. The family, the village, and finally the city, the polis, arise not merely as accidents of history or as conveniences for commerce, but as natural infrastructures through which human beings can flourish. And flourishing, in Aristotle's vocabulary, is not a private achievement but a shared achievement. The city exists, in a sense, not merely to keep us alive or to provide us with comfort, but to enable a form of life that can be judged good, store of virtue, and worthy of imitation. If we want to understand what a just and well-ordered society looks like, we must attend to the way the polis shapes character, sustains shared practices, and aligns law with the ends of human life. To begin with origins, Aristotle grounds political life in a natural sequence. The family is the first natural association. The male and female unite, the offspring come to be, and then the household yields more than mere subsistence. It yields the rudiments of cooperation, the formation of norms, the sense of obligation, and the beginnings of exchange. The next natural rung is the village or the neighborhood, a broader web of interdependence where friends and neighbors live among one another, trade, and resolve what counts as fair dealing. Then finally, the city emerges as a collective achievement of many households, a larger unity in which diverse people, with different aptitudes, holdings, and claims, come to live under shared institutions positioned to cultivate virtue, order affairs, and achieve a common good that cannot be realized by any single family or private individual alone. The leap from family and village to the polis is not accidental for Aristotle. He insists that human beings are by nature political animals, because only within the polis can reason about the good life in public, be guided by law that is reasons made public, and pursue excellence in a framework that rewards or punishes according to what is fitting for the life together. This is not a mere matter of governance by rules, it is a matter of governance by reasoned activity oriented toward virtue. The city, Aristotle says, is conceived for the sake of life and more fully for the good life. Life, yes, but life elevated by shared aims, cultivated dispositions, and a public order capable of sustaining virtue. In this sense, the polis is not an instrument merely for the protection of private rights or the maximization of wealth. It is a community with a telos, and that telos is the development of virtuous character in citizens through law, education, and common practice. Let us listen to Aristotle's own emphasis on the unity of ends and means. He is fond of drawing the connection between the good life and law, education, and shared appreciation for virtue. The city is supposed to provide a space in which people can deliberate about what is valuable, adopt laws that express the rational arrangement of the good, and practice the kind of civic life that habituates citizens to honor, justice, courage, temperance, and wisdom. In Aristotle's telling, the end of political association is more than the prevention of violence or the mere coordination of labor. It is the formation of the character that makes virtue possible as a practical matter, habits that incline the soul toward the noble and the just. This points to a central claim about justice in Aristotle. It is not simply a set of procedural rules, but a form of ordering that aligns distribution, recognition, and correction with virtue and the common good. Justice, in his account, is a family of virtues that governs the relationships among citizens. He distinguishes several kinds of justice, with a particular emphasis on distributive and corrective justice. Distributive justice concerns the fair distribution of honors, offices, and resources in proportion to what people deserve as a function of their virtue, contribution, or status within the city. Corrective justice, by contrast, is concerned with rectifying wrongs and restoring balance when exchanges go awry, whether in market dealings, personal interactions, or legal disputes. Justice, then, is not a scale or quantity doled out by mere arithmetic. It is a living set of proportional relationships that reflect the nature of good governance and the character of citizens. The distribution of honors, offices, and wealth is not a neutral matter in Aristotle's account. For him, the distribution should be in line with virtue and the appropriate roles people play in public life. Those who contribute more to the flourishing of the city deserve more influence and more honor, but the system must be carefully ordered so that the aim is the common good rather than the private advancement of any faction. The deliberate distribution of public honors becomes a practice that educates citizens, showing them which forms of excellence the city esteems and teaching them to pursue those excellences themselves. In this way, distributive justice is intimately connected to education and the cultivation of virtue. The laws of the city are not an abstract scaffolding, they are the channels through which citizens are formed to participate in the good life. Education itself is a central instrument in Aristotle's political theory. A city that wants to produce virtuous citizens must discipline its youth with curricula and rituals that cultivate moral perception, habituation to law, and respect for the shared good. The law can compel, but it cannot guarantee virtue by law alone. Education must accompany it, shaping desires so that following the law becomes a delight rather than a mere duty. This is where Aristotle's account intersects with his broader ethical theory. The aim of education is to draw out the rational and virtuous tendencies that lie within a human being, turning potential into practiced character. The polis must therefore be a school of virtue, a living pedagogy in which citizens learn by example, through participation in deliberation, public debate, and shared rituals of civic life. The role of law in the life of the city is thus central and consequential. Aristotle emphasizes that law is not simply a set of commands issued by rulers. Rather, law is the rational speech of a community seeking the common good, made public and binding on all factions and leaders alike. The central idea here, which modern readers often find chilling or challenging, is that a well-ordered city is governed by law that stands above the passions of rulers and factions. The law restrains tyranny, mediates conflict, and ensures a level playing field where virtuous conduct can be rewarded and vice can be checked. The law is the external scaffolding that supports internal virtue, a public form of reason that counters the pull of private interest. Let us consider the practical implications of these ideas by turning to historical modes of government that Aristotle engages with and critiques. He famously analyzes monarchies, tyrannies, aristocracies, oligarchies, democracies, and their respective corruptions or virtues. For Aristotle, there is a deep sense in which forms of government that align with virtue are the just and stable ones, while those that polarize power around a single faction or a base majority tend toward injustice or instability. The best regime, in his view, is a constitutional government, a sort of polity, in which sovereignty resides in the whole body of citizens, shaped by a mixed constitution in which elements of rule by the law, rule by the virtuous leaders, and broad popular participation combine to hold power in check and to temper passions with reason. To bring this home, imagine a polis that practices what Aristotle would call a mixed regime. There is a constitutional framework, but also magistracies that distribute offices in proportion to merit, a robust system of law that guides public action, and a citizenry educated to value the common good over private interest. In such a city, the virtues of citizens, courage, justice, temperance, prudence, are not simply private dispositions but social habits cultivated by the routine of public life. Deliberation about policies, debate in assemblies, and the public recognition of virtuous conduct through offices, honors, and the distribution of responsibilities. The aim is not to create a perfectly virtuous populace overnight. Virtue, after all, is cultivated over a lifetime. but to build a stable structure within which virtuous dispositions can be reliably nurtured and exercised. Aristotle's analysis of governance also includes a sobering note about the temptations that accompany any political arrangement. Each regime, even the best, is vulnerable to degeneration if the law ceases to guide public life, if rulers begin to value their own advantage over the common good, or if the configuration of offices and honors ceases to reward virtue and begins to reward popularity or wealth alone. The danger of democracy, in particular, is the risk that rule by the many degenerates into rule by the many who are poor or successful in manipulating public sentiment. The danger of oligarchy lies in the capture of power by a few for private advantage. The best hope, in Aristotle's telling, rests in the ability of law to channel passions, in the education that teaches citizens to see the long arc of the city's life, and in the practice of shared governance that erodes the line between ruling and being ruled. And what of the role of the citizen? For Aristotle, political life presupposes a citizen who is capable of virtue and who participates in the shared life of the city. The citizen must be not only a subject of law but an active participant in deliberation, the generation of policy, and the maintenance of order. The ideal, of course, is a citizenry that embodies the virtues needed for the city to flourish. Yet Aristotle recognizes that in any real city there will be diverse characters, dispositions, and fortunes. The question, then, is how to design a polis that accommodates difference while still pursuing unity of purpose. The law must be flexible enough to absorb differences in habit and background, yet firm enough to maintain the common aim. The teacher of virtue must be both guardian and guide of civic education, shaping the soul of the city without becoming its tyrant. These considerations lead to a pair of foundational forms of justice that structure civic life: distributive justice and corrective justice. Distributive justice asks, how should honors, offices, and goods be distributed among citizens in proportion to their virtue, their contribution to the city, and their rightful claims? Corrective justice asks, when harm occurs or when debts are not repaid, how do we restore equilibrium and fairness? The two forms of justice, Aristotle suggests, are not isolated. They govern the way citizens relate to one another in everyday exchanges, in political offices, and in the distribution of resources that enable virtuous action. A city that values justice must attend to both. Ensure that rewards align with virtue and effort, and ensure that wrongs are righted in a way that restores the balance of the civic life. Now, let us move from theory to vivid historical examples that illuminate how these ideas work in practice. Consider Athens in its classical period, where democracy emerged as a form of governance that sought to give a broad base of citizens a role in public decision-making. It was not a flawless system by Aristotle's standards. The city was deeply stratified, slavery persisted, wealth disparities shaped political influence, and demagogic energies could distort deliberation. Yet it embodied a public commitment to shared life, public law, and the education of citizens in the arts of persuasion and civic virtue. Athenian democracy, in its best moments, sought to harmonize the rule of law with a broad participation that could discipline itself through debate, argument, and collective action. And yet the city's dangers were present: faction, populism, and the risk that wealth or faction would capture political power, undermining the very virtue that the polity sought to foster. In contrast, Aristotle's own city in practice, though not a modern laboratory for his theory, offers a counterpoint to the idealized image of ancient democracy. Sparta, with its highly centralized, militarized order, presents a different route to collective goods. The Spartans claim to have created a state organized around a disciplined citizenry and a system of laws meant to sustain resilience and unity. Yet Sparta's justice is intelligible not as a universalizing virtue, but as a particular arrangement aimed at a specific end. Military strength, social order, the perpetuation of a ruling class. For Aristotle, such a regime could be praised for its stability and virtue glorified in a way that seems to produce a robust life for a certain kind of citizen, but it also reveals the risk of excluding participation, of subordinating the many to the ambitions of a few, and of substituting coercive law for shared deliberation. The central point is not to exalt either regime as perfect, but to illuminate how forms of government encode their own visions of the good, visions that must be tested against the standard of virtue and the shared life the polis is supposed to foster. These historical dramatizations lead us to consider two anchor anecdotes about Aristotle himself, moments that reveal how intimately political life and education in his age were bound to the life of philosophy and to the formation of rulers and citizens. The first anecdote concerns the founding of the Lyceum, the school that is famous for its peripatetic method. After leaving the Academy of Plato, Aristotle established a new center of inquiry in Athens, a place where students could walk, discuss, and examine the world in a spirit of disciplined curiosity. The image of the Lyceum is not simply a historical footnote. It is a living symbol of Aristotle's practical conviction that education is not merely to convey information, but to cultivate the capacity to reason well about political life. At the Lyceum, students moved through aisles of covered walkways, cafe-like interludes of dialogue, and a rhythm of lectures that encouraged careful judgment, the weighing of evidence, and the testing of ideas in the crucible of debate. This setting epitomizes Aristotle's conviction that the good life requires a cultivated mind, tuned to the demands of public reason, and prepared to engage with the city's problems in a way that is both rigorous and humane. The second anecdote concerns Aristotle's role as tutor to Alexander the Great. The royal education of a conqueror is not something easily reconciled with the idea of a gentle, purely virtuous citizenry. Yet Aristotle's influence on Alexander's early education illuminates a crucial dimension of political philosophy, the shaping of leadership through exposure to ideas about virtue, prudence, and the common good, even at the height of imperial ambition. Aristotle's task was to cultivate in a young prince the capacities not only to lead armies or expand territories, but to govern with a conception of the good life that could guide vast diversity under a single political umbrella. The tension between virtue and power, between the education of a ruler and the demands of realpolitik, is not easily resolved in Aristotle's own pages, but it is precisely the kind of tension that a thoughtful political philosophy must address. If we were to imagine the tutor's lessons translated into the politics of a great empire, we would hear Aristotle urging the young man to remember the city that nurtures him, to govern with law rather than fear, and to seek the common good even when personal privilege or conquest would offer an easier path. The later reception of Aristotle's political ideas in medieval and early modern thought is a story of transformation and reinterpretation, a testament to how a single body of ideas can be refracted through the lenses of different religious and political commitments. In the medieval world, Thomas Aquinas stands as the principal bridge between Aristotle's philosophy and Christian political theory. Aquinas does not simply transplant Aristotle's ideas into a Christian framework. He reinterprets them within a natural law tradition that grounds moral and political life in a divine order that human beings can participate in through reason and virtue. Aquinas famously defines natural law as the rational creature's participation in the eternal law. Law, for Aquinas, is the rule of practical reason for the common good given to humanity under God's governance of the world. In this sense, Aristotelian political anthropology is rescued and resituated within a theologically informed cosmology. The city's aim is to promote virtuous life, the law should reflect rational deliberation about the common good, and rulers must govern in a way that respects natural law and divine order. Aquinas thus reinterprets the polis as a site of natural and moral governance that remains true to Aristotle's insight that human beings flourish best when they live in fellowship governed by law and virtue. The early modern reception of Aristotle's political thought includes philosophers who both embraced and contested the idea of the virtuous regime. Think of Machiavelli, for instance, who did not share Aristotle's optimistic faith in virtue as the guiding principle of political life, but who nevertheless cannot escape Aristotle's influence in his discussion of mixed governments, prudence, and the dangers of unbounded liberty. In the Discourses on Livy, Machiavelli praises stable, mixed regimes that combine elements of aristocracy and democracy to check the worst impulses of each. This is not a naive endorsement of virtue as moral sentiment alone. It is a recognition that political life requires institutions that balance competing powers, that check tyranny, and that can endure the strains of war, faction, and popular passion. In this sense, Machiavelli extends Aristotle's insight about the power of law and the structure of government, even as he strips away the idealistic gloss and reframes political virtue in terms of stability, effectiveness, and prudence. Other early modern interpreters, including Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, push Aristotle into different directions, often challenging the assumption that virtuous regimes are both feasible and desirable in a plural modern world. Hobbes's Leviathan presents a starkly different anthropology. Humans are naturally anxious, competitive, and fearful, and only a strong sovereign can prevent a collapse into war of each against all. In Hobbes's framework, the virtuous life as Aristotle would understand it is a fragile dream that requires a technical solution, a powerful commonwealth to secure peace. Locke, by contrast, returns to a liberal natural rights vocabulary, arguing that the legitimate authority of the state rests on the consent of governed individuals who possess natural rights to life, liberty, and property. The Lockean synthesis preserves a sense in which reason, law, and the public good matter, but it relocates the ground of political authority from virtue rightly ordered to a framework of rights and contracts that can be universalized in plural communities. Aristotle's hopes for virtue-infused governance thus collide with modern pluralism that places high priority on individual rights, autonomy, and toleration of difference. These divergent receptions raise two bold counterarguments that contemporary readers often press against Aristotle's political vision. The first is a liberal argument about rights and autonomy. If the aim of politics is the formation of virtuous citizens through law and education, what happens in societies with deep pluralism, where citizens hold different beliefs about the good life, religious faiths, secular commitments, or divergent conceptions of the good, yet must share a political life? The liberal reply is that political legitimacy rests on consent and the protection of basic rights that transcend any single virtue tradition. In such a world, it would be naive to think that a single virtuous ideal, universalized across diverse communities, could sustain stable public life. Instead, rights-based frameworks, pluralism, and procedural legitimacy, like constitutional entrenchment, protection for minority rights, and robust mechanisms for deliberation, are necessary to prevent tyranny of the majority and the coercion of dissenters. The question for Aristotle in this light becomes how to design institutions that cultivate virtue without coercing a uniform vision of the good upon people who disagree about what virtue requires. Can a plural polity cultivate character when the shared ends themselves are contested? The liberal critique invites us to consider the limits of virtue-centered governance in a world of diverse beliefs and loyalties. The second counterargument flows from modern pluralism that takes seriously the fact of deep difference within communities, differences of religion, language, culture, and life paths. The pluralist challenge asks whether in such contexts the ideal of a unified virtuous citizenry is not a seductive fiction that glosses over real conflicts of values and identities. If the city's goal is a life of virtue through shared practice, education, and law, what of groups who do not share the same idea of the good, or who wish to pursue their own conceptions of flourishing within the same legal order? Aristotle's answer, emphasizing common education and the alignment of law with a shared conception of virtue, risks becoming coercive in such contexts. The modern critique asks whether the city can realistically cultivate a unity strong enough to support a just distribution of honors, offices, and resources when citizens disagree about what counts as virtue itself. This challenge invites a more robust, perhaps more liberal, model of civic education and law, a model that respects plural commitments, protects freedom of conscience, and seeks to reconcile conflicting visions of the good through inclusive deliberation and procedural legitimacy, rather than by insisting on a single, comprehensive moral order. To engage these counterarguments seriously, we should cross-reference Aristotle's other works, especially the Ethics, the Metaphysics, and the Poetics, to illustrate how political theory presupposes metaphysical and ethical commitments and how it has informed later political theorists across the centuries. In the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle grounds political life in a teleology, an account of human flourishing that is achieved through virtuous activity in the rational life. The key claim, the good for man is an activity of the soul in accordance with virtue, provides the normative barometer by which institutions and policies are judged. If the end of political life is the good life, then the laws, education, and shared practices of the city must be ordered toward fostering virtuous activity. This does not occur in a vacuum. It presupposes a particular anthropology, the belief that humans possess rationality, a potential for virtue, and a social nature that makes shared life intelligible and necessary. The metaphysics supplies the conceptual underpinnings for that anthropology, form and purpose, teleology, and the unity of the being of a living thing. The city's laws and institutions, in this sense, should resonate with the natural form of human life insofar as the human person is a rational, social, capable being whose development depends on the proper arrangement of form, matter, and function within a community. The Poetics contributes another line of cross-reference, though in a different register. The Poetics treats narrative, mimesis, and the capacity of drama to teach, move, and shape audiences. If the polis is a school of virtue, then the stories a culture tells, the forms of performance it celebrates, and the dramas it stages become essential to political education. The unity of action in a tragic plot, the cathartic experience of audiences, and the moral roles the hero must play all illuminate how a society educates its citizens to perceive virtue, to weigh passions against the public good, and to recognize the consequences of collective action. Aristotle's sense that law and virtue require cultivation, habituation, and shared ritual finds an analog in the stories a people tell about themselves. The myths, histories, and dramatic performances that teach citizens what kind of life counts as excellent and what kind of life should be avoided. The political life, then, is not merely a system of rules, it is a living narrative that enacts the common purposes of the city. Looking forward in time, Aristotle's political ideals exert a powerful but contested influence on Renaissance and modern political thought. The return to classical sources in the Renaissance brought a renewed interest in mixed regimes, civic education, and the cultivation of virtue as a public project. Think of figures such as Niccolò Machiavelli, who, while not endorsing a naive paternalism about virtue, nonetheless recognizes the structural necessity of balance and prudence in political life, what he calls the mixed constitution, which echoes Aristotle's best regime intuition. For Machiavelli, the practicalities of statecraft require institutions that can endure factions and passions. For Aristotle, the aim is to create a habitat in which virtue can be formed. The shared insight is that political life is not reducible to the pursuit of power or wealth, but is oriented to a common good that can outlive the passions of the moment, if institutions are wise enough to anchor themselves in reason and law. The modern era also gives us a broader set of interpretations, some more favorable to the virtue-centered ideal, others less so. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, for instance, revives the idea that citizens must actively participate in shaping the general will, a notion that resonates with Aristotle's emphasis on deliberative participation, but challenges it by foregrounding the primacy of freedom, equality, and direct self-legislation in a way Aristotle might find problematic. The liberal tradition from Locke to Rawls refashions Aristotle's concerns with virtue into a theory of rights, justice as fairness, and the legitimacy of political authority grounded in consent and the protection of basic liberties. The virtue-centered ideal persists in the works of contemporary civic theorists who emphasize public deliberation, virtue ethics in political life, and the design of institutions that nurture character while respecting plural commitments. In translating ancient political ideals into contemporary policy and education, we must be careful not to collapse the richness of Aristotle's account into a single, monolithic program. Yet there are thoughtful lines we can plausibly lift into public discourse and practical reform. First, the central role of education in forming citizens who can participate responsibly in public life cannot be overstated. A modern polis should invest in civics education that is not mere instruction about procedures, but a rigorous cultivation of virtue, critical thinking, and public responsibility. This means teaching students to recognize the ends of political life, to reason about the common good, to discern the difference between expedience and justice, and to practice dispute resolution with patience and respect. Second, the law must be seen as more than a repository of rules. It should be a living framework that embodies the rational ordering of public life. Law should be crafted with attention to the long arc of civic good, not merely the short-term interests of factions. Third, policy design should reflect a healthy bias toward mixed governance, distributing power across institutions and offices, Senate-like deliberations, representative assemblies, and citizenship charges that can guard against tyranny and the capture of the political process by any single group. Fourth, distributive justice should be tied to the cultivation of virtue in a way that rewards legitimate contributions to the common good while ensuring that the basic conditions of life, education, health, safety, and dignity are accessible to all citizens. This is not a call for a return to a naive unanimity about virtue. It is a call for a robust public reason that respects differences of view while insisting on a shared framework for political life. To make this practical in modern policy terms, we can outline a set of guiding questions and design principles. How should we conceive of the good life in a plural society? If the good life varies across communities, the policy would need to foster shared civic practices rather than enforce a uniform moral code. How do we promote virtuous deliberation without coercing private belief? This requires institutions that are transparent, accessible, pluralistic in representation, and designed to foster deliberation that is patient, evidence-based, and oriented toward the common good. How can education cultivate virtue in a world of digital information, competing narratives, and political polarization? A robust curriculum could integrate ethics, critical thinking, history, and civic life with real opportunities for students to participate in local governance, service projects, and deliberative forums that model the procedures of public life. How do we ensure justice in both distributive and corrective forms when resources are finite and factions are strong? Policy design must include transparent criteria for public distribution, robust mechanisms for redress of grievances, and independent institutions to monitor equity and accountability. In tying these reflections back to Aristotle's own vocabulary, we can return to a few anchor phrases that remain meaningful even after centuries of debate. The pole star is still the claim that the good life is the end of the city, that human beings flourish best when they live under law that reasonably orients the public toward virtue, and that education is a public enterprise meant to form citizens capable of discerning and pursuing the common good. The law is the reason of the city expressed in public form. Education is the practice that makes that law lived in the soul. The distribution of offices and honors must be aligned with virtue and the common benefit rather than with factional advantage. The city's life is the laboratory in which virtue can be tested and trained. As we consider contemporary politics, we should not pretend that Aristotle's vision can be realized in exactly his terms. The world is larger, more diverse, and more complicated than any ancient city-state could have imagined. Yet the underlying impulse toward a polity that aligns law with the rational pursuit of the good life, toward education as a tool for moral formation, toward the cultivation of virtue as a public enterprise, offers a reservoir of ideas that can still illuminate our debates. The question is not whether we can replicate ancient Athens or Sparta, but whether we can adapt their insights to our own conditions, drawing from the strengths of their achievements while learning from their limitations. To connect with Aristotle's own broader philosophical program, we can trace cross-references to other parts of his corpus. In metaphysics, the insistence on form and purpose supplies a metaphysical justification for teleology in politics. Human beings have a natural orienting end toward which their lives tend, and the city serves as the material and formal environment in which that end can be realized. In ethics, the emphasis on virtue as a stable disposition that drives rational choice underpins the political project. Citizens who habitually choose the noble and the just will inhabit a city that rewards such choices and shapes them further through governance and law. In poetics, the narrative dimension of civic life, the stories a people tell about their past, their heroes, and their ideals, shapes how citizens conceive of the city's mission and their roles within it. The polis, in this sense, is not only a regulatory machine, it is a tale that invites citizens to participate in a meaningful, shared drama of life. As we reflect on the long arc from Aristotle's Lyceum to medieval scholastic natural law, from Renaissance republicanism to modern debates about rights, pluralism, and democracy, we can locate a guiding motif. Political life is a craft of balancing ends and means, of aligning our institutions with human nature's tendency towards social life and the possibility of virtue, and of creating a shared space in which citizens can become the kind of people whose lives are worth living together. The aim is neither to romance a virtuous city into existence nor to abandon virtue for the sake of stability alone. It is to design a polis that makes the good life possible for as many people as possible without surrendering plural integrity to the tyranny of any single faction or creed. It is to imagine a polity in which law, education, and home imagination, justice, and symmetry cohere to enable citizens to grow toward a life worthy of the city's name. In closing, let us return to the practical takeaway that emerges from Aristotle's politics, even against the counterpoints of liberal theory and pluralist critique. The good city is the school of virtue, where the law shapes character, education inculcates the means of reasoned judgment, and the distribution of honors and resources follows the logics of merit and the common good rather than private appetite. It is a place where the citizen participates in deliberation, where the rulers are restrained by law, where offices are distributed in ways that reflect virtue, and where the education of the young is treated as public work rather than private privilege. It is a model not of perfect virtue in every citizen, but of a shared project that makes virtue possible for a community capable of enduring conflict, difference, and change. As we step into contemporary classrooms, policy labs, and city council meetings, we can carry with us Aristotle's core insistence that the city exists to enable the good life. The work is ongoing, the ideal demanding, and the challenge is substantial. Yet there remains in his argument a humility and a hope. We are not condemned to political fragmentation or to the tyranny of powerful minorities or majorities. We can design institutions that discipline the passions of the many and the few, cultivate the virtues of citizens through education and law, and pursue a form of life together that, while not exempt from conflict, aspires toward the shared good that all political life seeks to realize. In that sense, Aristotle's political animal remains a living invitation to consider not only what the city does for us, but what the city makes of us, and what we might be called to become through our collective practices, our laws, and our shared quest for a life well lived. Some nights we drift into a library where every shelf glows softly with the quiet insistence of ancient questions. Tonight, welcome to a corner of that library where the lamp is Aristotle and the book is the Organon, the collection that Aristotle gathered as a gardener gathers tools. With care, with purpose, and with the sense that a tool has limits and a purpose beyond its edge. The title Organon, a Greek word that later generations would translate as instrument or tool, invites us to see logic not as a dry set of rules, but as a toolkit for disciplined inquiry. Logic for Aristotle is not merely a branch of philosophy. It is the practical craft by which we think, test, classify, and move from what we observe toward what we can demonstrably claim. And as the toolkit is used, it reveals a larger architecture in which logic supports science, rhetoric shapes civic life, and poetry nourishes the moral imagination. Let us begin with origins. Aristotle inherited a tradition of asking how we come to know anything at all, but he reorganized that inquiry in a new, systematic way. The heart of his enterprise is the insistence that knowledge begins with first principles, but does not stop there. We do not merely collect facts, we seek the firm foundations upon which demonstrable conclusions can stand. The syllogism, that elegant triplet of premises leading to a conclusion, appears for him as a model of how reasoning should proceed, not as a parlor trick, but as a means to ensure that our conclusions ride on secure grounds. Consider the familiar chain that you could utter in a single breath, as one might whisper in a dim study. All humans are rational beings. Socrates is a human, therefore Socrates is rational. This is not mere rhetoric. Aristotle insists that if the premises are true and the logical form is valid, the conclusion follows with necessity. The syllogism, in its ideal form, shows how reasoning can move from general truths to particular instances with a kind of disciplined inevitability. In a larger sense, Aristotle's logic is a response to the world's complexity. The world is not simply a puzzle to be solved, nor a mosaic to be admired. It is a network of causes and effects, a field in which what is true must be shown by reasons that others can follow. And the structure of that reasoning rests on two kinds of causal consideration that remain with us: demonstration and first principles. Demonstration, in Aristotle's sense, does not merely confirm a claim. It explains it by showing that it cannot be otherwise given certain starting points and rules of inference. The first principles, the starting points, are the propositions we grasp with a sense of necessity or by worthy demonstration. They are not arbitrary. They are what the mind already intuitively holds to be true with a minimal degree of certainty, and from them we erect the chain of reasoning that bears the weight of truth across many steps. This is not a sterile method. It is rooted in a conviction about human understanding. We begin with what seems indispensable, move through the chain of reasoning, and only then arrive at knowledge that bears the hallmarks of science. If the syllogistic is the backbone of Aristotle's Organon, the larger project is to show how rational inquiry can illuminate not only logics of argument, but the natural world. And there the circle closes with a teleology, the sense that nature has a direction, an end, an order that human inquiry can glimpse if we listen carefully enough. Aristotle does not reduce science to chance. He treats nature as a theater in which causes unfold toward ends that we can understand by examining purposes and designs immanent in living things and in inanimate processes alike. To understand how this method works in practice, consider the way Aristotle frames demonstrations and the role of first principles. A demonstration is not a mere tautology. It is a chain of reasoning in which each step is supported by a previous, more secure step, and the entire chain rests on a foundation understood to be true beyond reasonable doubt. The major premise, the minor premise, and the conclusion together form a structure that can be repeated, cross-checked, and extended. The beauty of Aristotle's model lies in its insistence that reasoning must be anchored in premises that are known or stand in a demonstrable proximity to knowledge that is known with certainty. In this sense, the Organon is not a mere catalogue of rules for argument. It is a practical plumbing system for the flows of inquiry. And yet Aristotle does not pretend that syllogistic is the last word in human understanding. He is acutely aware of the limits of the method, the hazard of assuming the universality of a premise, the danger of mistaking language for reality, or the temptation to imagine that logic can do all the work of science. The critique, in his own terms, is not to abandon logic but to train it, so that it becomes a discipline for extracting causes and for organizing experience into intelligible patterns. Hence the emphasis on observation, classification, and systematic inquiry, on the way the mind moves from sense data to universal claims, and how the best demonstrations emerge when we ascend from particulars to generalities with a secure map of how the premises are linked. As we move from the structure of syllogistic to the living sciences, Aristotle's approach looks less like an abstract system and more like a life detective story. He is not merely counting things. He is looking for the order that makes sense of what exists. Consider the biological project that quietly unfolds amid his organon-like discipline in the biological treatises that would become part of his broader scientific ambition. Aristotle's biology is not a random collection of observations. It is a proto-science of classification and explanation that treats living beings as organized beings with ends or goals toward which they tend. In his Historia Animalium and related works, we encounter a performer's sense of a natural taxonomy, an attempt to classify animals according to a rational scheme that reflects both their similarity and their difference. The method is observational first, classificatory second, and explanatory third. To see how this works, imagine a natural historian walking along a shoreline of the Aegean coast, making careful notes about the differences between fish and birds, between land-dwelling animals and those that navigate water, between creatures with blood and those without it, and with each observation seeking an underlying pattern that would allow the physician of nature to tell a story about why a creature is as it is. In this sense, Aristotle's biology is a drama of purposes, a narrative about why organisms show certain features. He does not write in a single paragraph of teleological flourish. He writes through a series of careful distinctions about parts, functions, and the ways in which form and function cooperate. The heart, the lungs, the brain, the senses, these organs are read through a lens that sees their parts as contributing to the life of the whole. But Aristotle does not simply say, look, this is why this organ exists. He encourages us to look, to observe, to compare, to classify, and then to explain how these features come to be in connection with the animal's life conditions. The observer's work, careful dissection of behavior, careful observation of reproduction, development, and the way organisms move and interact with their environment, is the engine that drives his science. And in every case, the guiding principle is teleology, or at least a robust sense that natural processes proceed toward ends that have significance for the life of the organism and for our understanding of nature as a rational system. If we turn now to the Poetics, Aristotle offers a different kind of project, a theory of art that is inseparable from his ethical and political concerns. Poetics is not simply about aesthetics. It is about how humans imagine, judge, and feel the moral dimensions of life through stories. The central claim is that tragedy, in particular, is an imitation of action that is serious, complete, and of a certain magnitude. But what does it mean for tragedy to imitate action? It means that drama does not merely mirror random events. It constructs a narrative structure with cause and effect, a plot that has a beginning, middle, and end, and a moral pace that invites spectators to participate in perception, emotion, and judgment. Aristotle's claim is that tragedy has the capacity to awaken pity and fear in the audience and to purify those feelings through a process of catharsis, a release that leaves the spectator with a renewed sense of order in life and a clarified sense of moral insight. In tracing the logic of poetics, we encounter a theory of mimesis, or imitation, that is not a mere replication of reality, but a filtered reproduction shaped by artistic form. The playwright chooses what to imitate, what to emphasize, and what to omit. The audience receives a structured experience in which emotion and understanding are braided together. The structure of plot matters as much as the psychology of character. The characters' decisions must be intelligible within the logic of the plot. Their fate must be consonant with the internal logic of the story's world. This is not a cold technical manual. It is a theory about how narratives form moral imagination, how human beings learn from observing the consequences of choices made under pressure, how we come to feel the weight of ethical conflict, and how we are invited to reflect on questions of courage, pride, hamartia, misjudgment, and the possibility of reconciliation. Rhetoric in Aristotle's account is the art of persuasive discourse. It is practical, social, and immediately involved in civic life. Rhetoric is not mere persuasion as manipulation. It is the capacity to discover and deploy the available means of persuasion in a given situation. In Aristotle's words, rhetoric is the faculty of observing in any given case the available means of persuasion. The emphasis here is not a cynical exploitation of emotion. It is a mature recognition that language can shape belief, that audiences are not purely rational machines, and that different audiences require different appeals. Rhetoric thus becomes a bridge between theory and action, a way to connect insights about truth to the realities of policy, law, and public persuasion. Consider how a public speaker must tailor an argument to the temperament and beliefs of an audience, to the values at stake, to the constraints of time, and to the credibility of the speaker. The art of rhetoric, properly understood, is a discipline of responsibility. It invites the speaker to build warrant for claims that respect the audience's capacity to judge, to guard against deceit, and to aim at persuasion that leads toward just action. Across the organon's sections, logic, demonstration, and scientific method, through biology's taxonomy and teleological explanations, into the dramatic theory of poetics and the civic instrumentality of rhetoric, Aristotle reveals an integrated architecture of thought. This is not a set of isolated disciplines, but a coherent world in which method, observation, and imagination are mutually informing. The logic of demonstration provides legitimacy for science. The teleology that orients inquiry offers a sense of purpose to explain why things are the way they are, even as modern science challenges us to rethink those ends in light of new empirical horizons. Rhetoric and poetics cultivate the human life world, how we argue, how we feel, how we imagine moral life, so that knowledge does not float above life but remains embedded in it, in policies we enact, in stories we tell ourselves, in the moral choices we face. To appreciate how Aristotle's work traveled through time, let us pause for a moment at two kinds of historical corridors where his ideas moved: the translation and transmission corridors that carried his logic across cultures, and the interpretive corridors that re-embedded his thought into new intellectual ecologies. The first corridor is the long and winding path through Arabic scholarship into Latin Europe. In the period of the Islamic Golden Age, thinkers such as Averroes, known in Latin as Averroes, engaged deeply with Aristotle's works. Averroes wrote extensive commentaries on Aristotle, aiming to defend and articulate the unity of reason with religious faith, to show that reason and revelation could be reconciled within a coherent natural philosophy. In the wake of Averroes' glosses and translations, Latin scholars encountered Aristotle in a transformed light. The Latin translations, some of them as late as the work of Gerard of Cremona, who helped bring the Latin mind into contact with the organon and with the Aristotelian corpus, redistributed the tools of logic and natural philosophy. The effect in Europe was not merely academic, it reshaped the very habits of scholastic inquiry, turning logic into a central method for theology and philosophy. The way of arguing, the way of presenting demonstrations, the way of ordering a question into a syllogistic structure, all of these found new energy in the Latin scholastic environment. This leads us to the second corridor, scholastic appropriation, especially in the hands of Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas, writing in the 13th century, did not simply adopt Aristotle as a set of abstract rules. He wove Aristotle's logical method into a larger project, the integration of faith and reason. In his Summa Theologiae and in his broader philosophical program, Aquinas treats demonstration and demonstration-like reasoning as a major source of rational justification for theological truths. He borrows the logic of the organon, the teleological reading of nature, and the carefully architected argumentation that could be submitted to rigorous critical exam within the framework of Christian doctrine. For Aquinas and his contemporaries, Aristotle becomes a tool not to degrade revelation, but to articulate it with a precision that a school could wield. The Aristotelian method, adapted to the Christian metaphysical schema, provides a way of thinking about natural law, human purposes, and the place of humans in nature that is at once empirical and normative. The logic used in the 13th century to reason about God's creation, the soul, and the common good owes a significant debt to Aristotle's insistence on demonstrative reasoning and on connecting cause to effect in an intelligible chain. As the Renaissance unfolds, the reception of poetics and the broader Aristotelian program exercises a new energy in four primary ways. First, the revival of ancient texts and the increasing comfort with humanist rhetoric encourage a more conscious use of Aristotle's vocabulary for analyzing drama. This is not simply a matter of using Aristotle's rules. It is a re-engagement with the idea that a drama is a conscious human instrument for shaping moral imagination. Shakespeare's dramatic theory, though not a direct rewrite of Aristotle, reflects the germ of Aristotelian insight, tragedy organized by cause, character, and fate, a plot that navigates through reversal and insight to lead toward a catharsis in the audience. Shakespeare's plays provide living laboratories for the Aristotelian impulse to consider how mimesis, plot, character, and ethical conflict interact to create meaning. Even as Shakespeare's sophistication and innovation surpass the constraints of Aristotle's framework, the ancient scaffold remains an indispensable point of reference. The Renaissance theater, in its experimentation with form and its deeper exploration of human psychology, embodies an Aristotelian ambition to explain how human agents act within the structure of a story and within the constraints of moral life. Second, the cycle of translation and commentary continues to shape Aristotelian influence. The Latin and Hebrew and Greek editions ripple across centuries, inviting new readers to test the organon against new problems and new data. The formal logic that Aristotle develops is tested by the emergence of more precise forms of reasoning, by the advent of mathematical logic centuries later, by the critical revolutions that accompany the scientific methods of the early modern period. Yet the core ambition remains, to provide a disciplined way of thinking about how we obtain knowledge, how we justify it, and how our reasoning must be shaped to serve human flourishing in the domains of science, politics, and art. Third, the moral and political implications of Aristotle's integrated architecture gain new life in modern discussions of science and society. The idea that logic informs science, that rhetoric informs civic life, and that poetry informs moral imagination is a map for understanding how knowledge is mobilized in public life. It is a reminder that the life of reason is not a sterile pursuit, but a living practice in which what we say about the world, how we persuade others, and how we imagine who we are all matter to the shaping of societies. Aristotle's insistence on showing why things happen, on recognizing purposes in nature, on imagining the good life, and on the social function of persuasive language remains a resonant voice in contemporary debates about science communication, education, public policy, and the ethical use of language. Fourth, and perhaps most exciting, is the way modern science and philosophy test Aristotle's assumptions without simply discarding them. Kant's critique of pure reason, for example, presses us to examine the universality of the syllogistic form. In the Kantian frame, the mind does not supply knowledge from bare sense data alone. Rather, it brings to experience the categories and structures that make knowledge possible. The famous opening line of the Critique of Pure Reason, "That reason seeks unity and order," casts light on Aristotle's own teleology and aim for integrated systems, but it also reveals limits. Kant challenges the idea that logical form alone suffices to guarantee knowledge independently of how the mind structures experience. In effect, Kant marks a turning point. The logical toolkit that Aristotle treats as universal across rational inquiry must contend with the increasingly sophisticated understandings of logic and mathematics that follow. The move to propositional and predicate logic, developed by Frege, Russell, and later by modern logicians, questions whether the universality of the syllogistic is the only route to rigorous inference. The logic landscape expands, and yet the spirit of Aristotle's method, attention to structure, to the justification of conclusions, to the need for clear demonstration, persists. The dialogue between Aristotle's organon and later logic is a living conversation about what it means to reason well. Yet the story does not end with logic alone. The biological program, with its teleology, invites both critique and reinterpretation in light of Darwin's theory and later developments. The modern move away from teleological explanations in biology does not simply dismiss Aristotle. It invites a refinement. Darwin's natural selection can be read as a replacement of final causes with causal explanations grounded in variation, heredity, and differential survival. But even here, the Aristotelian intuition, seeing nature as an organized whole with an end or purpose discernible through careful observation and comparison, retains its value as a heuristic. The idea that nature is intelligible because it exhibits order and coherence, that its processes can be described in terms of function and aim, is a frame that early scientists often found fruitful to work within, even as they pushed beyond teleological readings to more mechanistic accounts. The contemporary conversation about teleology in biology, sometimes framed as teleonomy, acknowledges that natural processes exhibit goal-directed behavior without invoking intelligent design. Aristotle's sense that form and function belong together, that a living thing's parts exist for the sake of the whole, continues to echo in modern biology, in systems theory, and in the philosophy of biology. In speaking of real-world applications, you can hear Aristotle's influence in two directions that keep shaping how we live and work today. First, the practical art of classification, observation, and explanation remains central to the practice of science. Taxonomic work, medical diagnosis, ecological monitoring, and even data science begin with careful observation, the kind of careful classification that Aristotle practiced and taught. When biologists classify species, when clinicians diagnose based on symptom patterns, when ecologists trace the causes of an outbreak, they are performing an Aristotelian science in a modern key. They begin with data, they search for patterns, they test hypotheses, and they seek maxima and minima of reliability for their conclusions. The logic of demonstration still undergirds how scientists advance from hypothesis to verified theory. Second, the ethical and political implications of rhetoric and poetics in public life are vivid realities in our time. The art of persuasion is not, and should not be, a mere instrument of manipulation. Aristotle's insistence on the ethical dimensions of rhetoric, on the responsibility of those who argue to respect the audience, to seek truth, to avoid sophistry, to aim at just persuasion, offers a timeless caution to our media-saturated environment. The modern political sphere, where arguments are contested, where rhetoric shapes policy, where public life turns on votes and opinions, pivots on the same hinge. What counts as a persuasive, credible, and responsible use of language? Aristotle's framework invites us to attend to the character of the speaker, ethos, the structure of the argument, logos, and the emotional resonance of the appeal, pathos, not to seal victory in debate, but to illuminate truth and to guide action toward common goods. To those who want to connect Aristotle to metaphysics, de anima, ethics, and politics, the map is not a bundle of separate islands but an integrated ecosystem. In metaphysics, Aristotle asks about being, cause, form, and the principle of first causes. In De Anima, he asks what life and mind are, what it means to have a soul, and how sensation, appetite, and intellect arise in living beings. In ethics, he asks what constitutes a good life for human beings, what counts as virtue, and how rational choice aligns with practical wisdom. In politics, he asks how the city and its institutions cultivate virtue, how law shapes character, and how citizens relate to the shared good. Logic and demonstration are the scaffolds of knowledge. Rhetoric is the skill by which citizens persuade with justice and truth. Poetry, especially tragedy, shapes moral imagination and community sympathy. The integrated architecture is not a mere program of instruction. It is a vision of a life lived in concert with reason, with communal life, and with art that calls forth moral insight. The organon is the gateway to an entire world in which knowledge, action, and beauty are brought into a single, living harmony. Now, let us pause for a moment and listen to an important caveat, the countercurrents that have shaped and reshaped Aristotelian thought. If we are to honor the depth of Aristotle's project, we must also reckon with the ways later thinkers challenged him. One major counterargument comes from Immanuel Kant, who challenged the universality and sufficiency of the syllogistic, and who reframed the project of philosophy around the categories of understanding and the conditions for possibility rather than a purely demonstrative chain of propositions. In the Prolegomena to Any Future Metaphysics, Kant points to the role of synthesis, the active role of the mind in organizing experience, and the limits of empirical knowledge to capture what lies beyond possible experience. The line "thoughts without content are empty, intuitions without concepts are blind" marks a turning to a more dynamic interaction between reason and experience, a move away from Aristotle's strict reliance on syllogistic as the backbone of demonstration. Kant's critique invites us to see that logic is not a fixed set of rules, but a living instrument that must adapt to the structure of knowledge, the nature of our cognitive faculties, and the demands of modern science. Another set of counterarguments arises in the story of logic itself. The turn to modern propositional and predicate logic, pioneered by Frege, continued by Russell and Whitehead, and extended in the 20th century by Tarski, Hilbert, and later by many others, shifts the center of gravity away from the traditional syllogistic apparatus as the sole instrument of rigorous reasoning. This shift does not merely replace one toolkit with another. It reframes the very idea of logical validity, the role of quantification, and how we handle abstract entities. The Aristotelian syllogism, powerful as it is for certain domains, meets new demands in mathematics, computer science, and philosophy that require a richer logic capable of expressing universals, particulars, relations, and the subtleties of language with greater precision. And yet, even as the modern logical toolkit expands, the pedagogical virtue of Aristotle's method, learning to see the connections among assumptions, the disciplined structuring of arguments, the insistence on demonstration, remains vividly instructive. The critique does not close the door on Aristotle. It invites a deeper engagement with how to import his spirit into a more complex, more technical, and more specialized world. The third major countercurrent concerns biology and teleology. Aristotle's teleological interpretation of natural phenomena, where natural processes are explained by reference to their ends, faces a critical re-examination in modern biology. The Darwinian revolution reframes explanation around historical processes of variation, selection, and gradual change, rather than final causes alone. Where Aristotle might say that organs exist because they serve a natural end, Darwin would say that the distribution of those organs across lineages results from differential survival and reproduction over deep time, with teleology recast as a useful heuristic rather than an ontological claim about nature's design. Yet many contemporary philosophers of biology resist a simple rejection of teleology. They adopt a language of teleology that is compatible with empirical findings, using teleonomy as a descriptive shorthand for the appearance of goal-directed behavior in organisms without invoking purposeful agency. In this way, Aristotle's intuition about form and function continues to resonate, though the vocabulary changes. The science of biology, in embracing mechanistic explanations, still depends on the same cognitive operation that Aristotle prized. To explain phenomena by their causes, to connect micro-level structures to macro-level functions, and to reveal the systematic coherence of living systems. With these counterarguments in view, we can come back to the heart of Aristotle's integrated program. The logic of the organon provides the method, but it cannot stand alone without the other domains that Aristotle treats as essential to human understanding. The same tool that helps us see how a syllogism moves from premises to conclusion also helps us see the larger architecture of thought. How logic informs science by clarifying the structure of proofs and the chain of reasoning. How rhetoric informs civic life by exploring how words shape belief and action within a community. How poetry informs moral imagination by inviting us to inhabit the lives, decisions, and emotions of others through the drama of imitation. If we hold these strands together, we glimpse the possibility of a life guided by reason not as a sterile calculus but as a living practice, one that seeks truth with humility, aims at the good, and invites others to participate in shared inquiry. As we reflect, we can weave in cross-references that deepen the texture of Aristotle's thought. In metaphysics, the quest for the causes of being and the place of form provides a philosophical backdrop to his logic and his science. The De Anima offers a psychology that grounds his reasoning about perception, sense, and the soul's powers, tying the study of living beings to questions about knowledge and experience. Ethics and politics bring the question of how rational inquiry becomes a way of life and a shared political project. The virtuous life, for Aristotle, is inseparable from a rational cultivation of character that fits a political community. And in each case, the organon plays a crucial role. It is the instrument by which we critique, refine, and expand our knowledge. Logic informs science, guiding us in establishing what we can know and how we can know it. Rhetoric informs civic life, shaping the way communities deliberate, persuade, and decide what counts as just action. Poetics informs moral imagination, inviting us to experience life through stories that reveal the complexity of human motives, the fragility of virtue, and the possibility of growth. To end this passage with a sense of living continuity, we can hold in view a few concrete cross-references and real-world threads that tie Aristotle's enduring questions to our own lives. The first thread is the practice of classification in science. When you hear a biologist describe the taxonomic categories of a living organism, or a physician organize symptoms into differential diagnoses, think of Aristotle's habit of looking for natural groupings and shared features. Think of the syllogistic in action as an implicit model for how evidence from observation can be arranged into premises that justify a provisional claim. The second thread is the power of language to shape thought and action. In classrooms, boardrooms, and online forums, the rhetorical art of crafting arguments, balancing ethos, logos, and pathos, operates in a way that Aristotle anticipated. The best arguments are those that are as clear and compelling as they are morally attentive. The third thread is the moral imagination and the power of story to illuminate ethical life. When theater, film, or literature invites us to inhabit another perspective, we are performing a version of Aristotelian mimesis that fosters empathy, self-understanding, and social reflection. Let us close by returning to a few quotations that anchor this expansive journey, not as rigid rules but as living invitations. In Metaphysics, Aristotle writes, "All men by nature desire to know." This simple, almost childlike opening reveals a lifelong conviction. Inquiry is not a luxury but a fundamental impulse of human life. In De Anima, the soul is spoken of as the form of the living body, a phrase that invites us to see life as inseparable from its organizing principle. In Poetics, we are invited to consider tragedy as the imitation of an action that is serious, complete, and of a certain magnitude. The claim that tragedy exercises pity and fear, and thereby purges those emotions, catharsis, speaks to the moral seriousness with which art presses upon the soul. In Rhetoric, the sententia takes shape. Rhetoric is the art of discovering in any given case the available means of persuasion. And in the classical syllogistic, the chain of premises leads us to a conclusion with necessity, a reminder that a well-formed argument can carry us toward truth with disciplined elegance. These are not merely historical curiosities. They are instructions for a life that aims to think well, to observe carefully, to argue honestly, to imagine richly, and to act with a sense of responsibility toward others. Aristotle invites us to inhabit a practical philosophy, a philosophy that asks not only what is true, but what is just, not only what is beautiful, but what is good for a city, not only what can be proven, but what can be lived in truth. In the quiet room of this Snooze philosophy segment, let us listen to the old cadence of his voice, the careful, patient, and generous voice that invites us to approach knowledge as a shared voyage. The organon is more than a compendium of methods. It is a living invitation to cultivate our ability to see, to argue, to imagine, and to care. If we listen closely, we may not arrive at a final, definitive account of every question Aristotle asked, but we will leave with a richer sense of how to ask questions well, how to hold our beliefs with humility and rigor, and how to participate in the long conversation that makes us more human, more thoughtful, and more ready to contribute to the life we share.